I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
Today we are watching the US economy slide into the abyss, and behind it are decisions that have shocked the world. But what if I told you that these events could have been prevented if one key figure had simply left things alone? Imagine an entire country, and possibly the world, on the brink of crisis, and it all started with one executive order signed by Donald Trump.
That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
Trump, calling the day global tariffs were imposed Liberation Day, thought his moves would save the economy, but it turned into a true economic apocalypse for the rest of us. It all started with one bold but highly controversial move, a minimum tariff of 10% for all countries, with additional duties for trading partners, including allies like the EU, Canada, and Mexico. Trump decides that with tariffs on cars and goods, especially on imports from Europe and Asia, he can get things done. But that it actually led to the price spikes, the collapse of commodity markets, and the economic disasters we're still feeling today. What if I told you that the US economy has changed 180 degrees in the last 2 months? In just 2 months, we have witnessed an economic collapse that might not have been as devastating if Trump had perhaps just let the markets run their course. But he chose a different path, imposing tariffs that have not only jeopardized relationships with allies, but have driven up commodity prices and destroyed supplies. And that's not all. But the consequences are not just about the economy. Issues of social justice and the rights of citizens, especially the most vulnerable, have risen to the top of the agenda. Plenty of Americans are losing access to health care, social security benefits, and veterans are losing their most essential benefits. Trump's decisions to cut Medicaid and social programs don't just threaten their well-being, they do so against the backdrop of an economic collapse where every day becomes a fight for survival.
The higher the tariff, the more likely it is to have them come into the country.
The higher the tariff, the more you're going to put on the value of that piece, those goods, the higher people are going to pay in shops.
And what are we seeing in politics? How those who once supported him at the polls are starting to lose faith. It appears that key states that not long ago were solid bastions of support for Trump are starting to crumble. Florida and Wisconsin, the very fortresses that secured his victory, now threaten to become his nightmare. But what caused this turnaround? Mistakes in economic policy, short-sightedness in governance.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
The world is in a panic, markets are falling, commodity prices are rising, and life is getting harder for Americans. How will Trump respond to this crisis? Why does he continue to focus on secondary issues like Tesla and cryptocurrencies instead of working to save the economy? Could he have avoided this chaos if he had made other decisions? What is really behind this crisis, and can America get out of this corkscrew? We'll look at how his decisions destroyed a country whose economy was once the strongest in the world, and what could happen if the situation spirals out of control.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
When Donald Trump signed an executive order imposing global tariffs, no one could have predicted how quickly and how much the move would affect the global economy. Many analysts warned at the time that the president's actions could lead to serious consequences, but few guessed that it would become a real economic apocalypse for the United States and even the entire world. At first glance, Trump's decision was simple enough, imposing minimum tariffs on all imported goods and increasing duties on products produced in countries such as China, the European Union, Japan, and other major trading partners. But this move hid not only economic logic, but also the personal ambitions of a president seeking to consolidate his power and punish those who, in his opinion, unfairly exploit American resources.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
Trump announced a 10% minimum tariff for all countries, and also announced a 25% duty on imported cars. He stated that such measures were necessary to protect American manufacturers, which was already evident in the first weeks after the decree was announced. The economic consequences would be much more severe than economists predicted. Some of them called it a revolutionary step in economic policy, while others warned that such measures could lead to economic collapse. A few weeks later, it became clear that the market was not reacting as expected. The cost of many goods rose sharply, and manufacturers who had previously focused on cheap imported goods began to suffer huge replacement costs. One of the most controversial decisions was the imposition of tariffs on goods coming from the European Union. Trump, known for his hardline approach to trade, bluntly stated that EU countries were trading hard with America while, in his opinion, their products were not worth the money they demand for them. Trump didn't even try to hide his displeasure with the policies of the EU, which he said constantly takes advantage of our manufacturers. In response, European countries began preparing retaliatory measures, and by all appearances, the crisis became unstoppable. But this was only the first step in his destructive policies.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
Trump announced new tariffs on goods from Vietnam, which he believes has tried to enter American territory. Tariffs on Vietnamese goods increased by up to 46%, causing an uproar in trade circles. However, it was the decision to impose 39% duties on all goods coming from Taiwan that drew the most attention. Trump has accused Taiwan of taking away all of the U.S. advantages in the production of semiconductors and computer chips, claiming that America was once the world leader in this field, but has now all but lost its position. Such drastic measures shook trade markets, and America's allies began to feel betrayed. Soon after the tariffs were announced, a veritable global trade war began. China, which continued to build up its manufacturing sector despite economic sanctions, responded to the U.S. tariffs by imposing its own sanctions. Markets around the world began to react to such events. Global instability caused prices of basic commodities such as oil, metals, and food to skyrocket. Countries that had previously been major economic partners of the U.S. began looking for ways to diversify their trade relationships, which had a serious impact on America's foreign trade.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
Soon after, economists began to revise their forecasts, and while a month ago they were predicting a 3.9% growth in the U.S. economy, Now the forecasts have become much more pessimistic. The projected growth dropped to 2.3%, and a few weeks later the situation deteriorated even more. As a result, the economy was on the verge of recession, and the labor market, with its many job losses, began to show the first signs of alarm. Economists began to wonder, what if Trump had not interfered with trade relations and let the economy develop naturally? Of course, it is difficult to say how the situation would have developed in the absence of such drastic interventions, but one thing is clear: his policies have had devastating consequences. The US economy became vulnerable to external shocks, and the president's decision on tariffs only exacerbated this. With each passing day, the situation became more strained. Trump's impact on the economy and relations between countries became a hotly debated topic around the world. All these measures, announced as liberating the economy, eventually led to an economic collapse in which not only US citizens but entire countries were affected. The market reaction was not only predictable but also inevitable. In the face of such unstable decisions, international companies began to adjust their business strategies, which in turn intensified the global economic crisis.
They're doing what they should be doing, perhaps, for the European Union, but it does create ill will. And as you know, we're going to be doing reciprocal tariffs. So whatever they charge us, we're charging them.
But all this was just the beginning. As it turned out, the instability caused by the imposition of tariffs affected not only the economies of other countries, but also the domestic stability of the United States. Trump, despite his determination and confidence in the rightness of his steps, soon realized that his liberation of the economy turned out not to be a victory, but a real tragedy for the country. Canadian experts argued that such a move by Trump could be an economic disaster for the two countries, and as it turned out, their fears were not in vain. The US economy has begun to face deep problems with declining exports and rising prices for consumer goods. Amid this economic turmoil, the decline in the flow of Canadian tourists only accelerated the decline in revenues for US tourists, ushers the hotel and restaurant industry. The decline in US tourism revenues was as much as 15% in some regions, which had an immediate impact on local businesses. Tourists from other countries also began to reduce their trips to the US, fearing instability and a sharp rise in prices for goods and services.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year, in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
However, Trump's actions were not limited to the economy and trade. Amid the imposition of tariffs and economic chaos, major changes in the political environment, both in the US and abroad, began to take place. Countries, including Canada, were shaken not only by Trump's foreign trade policies, but also by his openly aggressive attitude toward human rights. This has been particularly pronounced in his migrant policy. From the moment he took office, Trump began taking harsh measures to deport illegal immigrants who he believed were becoming a threat to national security. Unfortunately, his actions have not been limited to just the law. Not only did he strengthen border control, but he also introduced new, harsher methods of deportation, which drew sharp criticism both inside the US and abroad. For example, not long ago, a report was published on how migrants were deported without due process. According to sources, some 250,000 people were removed from the country over the course of a year, many of whom did not even receive full legal representation. This sparked a storm of discontent among human rights activists and experts, who claimed that the Trump administration's actions violated international human rights conventions. The deportation of several groups of migrants to El Salvador has been particularly at the center of the debate, where research organizations say many of those deported lacked sufficient grounds for deportation and faced violence and threats upon their return.
Well, when you look at the kind of input Musk has been having into politics, there has been some polling done which suggests there is a strong dissatisfaction with.
But even more high profile was the case of the absurd kidnapping of a female student off the street by ICE agents. The woman accused of being in the US illegally was detained without charge and deported without trial. There were more and more examples of such cases, and criticism from the opposition and human rights activists only grew. Accusations of brutal human rights violations began to be heard from every corner of the country, and this only worsened the public perception of Trump. However, political decisions related only to foreign and domestic security were not the only problems that emerged amidst global instability. The domestic economic crisis that occurred after the tariffs were imposed also had a serious impact on the social sphere. The most vulnerable segments of the population, pensioners, large families and veterans, began to suffer from cuts in government programs and severe budgetary measures aimed at reducing social spending. Consequently, budget cuts, such as drastic cuts to Medicaid programs, have caused widespread protests and discontent among the general population.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
Trump claimed that these measures were a necessary evil in order to stabilize the economy, but they have been a disaster for most people. According to statistics, in the first year of these restrictions, more than 1.5 million people lost access to health care, leading to an increase in homelessness and a worsening social crisis. Particularly alarming was the large number of veterans among those affected, who, according to Trump, were supposed to feel protected. But in practice, their lives have only gotten worse. Cuts in benefits and the denial of veterans' health care have led to a wave of protests among military personnel and their families. Human rights organizations around the world condemned Trump's policies as unworthy for a nation that claims to be a world leader. An important point was also how these domestic issues began to overlap with international politics. The US began to lose respect among its allies, such as Canada and European Union countries, who increasingly raised questions about the need to renegotiate the terms of cooperation with America. Tariffs and economic measures designed to protect the economy became a symbol to other countries that the US was no longer willing to be the bulwark of stability it once was. Integration into the global economy became increasingly difficult for America, and the question of whether the US could regain its economic position on the world stage remained open.
Including Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon. President Trump with the Irish Prime Minister visiting the White House today. The president suggesting his tariffs won't stop here, saying, of course, I'm going to respond. And tonight, right here, the new poll showing 56% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the economy. The number's even worse now on the president's tariffs. ABC's chief White House correspondent Mary Bruce leading us off.
Today, President Trump side by side in the Oval Office with the head of the Irish government.
Thus, this whole situation has become not just an economic disaster, but a vivid example of how domestic political decisions can affect global processes and relations between states. Trump, despite his confidence in his policies, actually became the architect of the destruction of relations that have been building for years. With each passing day, it became more and more evident that Trump's support among his original loyalists was beginning to weaken. Countries that had previously been considered reliable allies of the United States now viewed American policy with distrust. And within America itself, the situation was becoming more and more alarming. This became particularly evident in key political regions such as Florida and Wisconsin, which had historically been stalwart bastions of Trump and his Make America Great Again movement. Florida, previously unwavering in its support for Trump, has now become a battleground, and his standing in that state has begun to seriously falter. In one of the most important electoral races, the 6th District, which until recently supported him by 30 points, was now seeing instability.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
These changes were not limited to domestic political struggles. They were part of a broader process of change in the U.S. political landscape. And all of these developments prompted the question, is it possible that Trump's support is beginning to melt, especially among voters he once considered unconditional supporters? Too many promises have been unfulfilled. Too many decisions that were supposed to bring prosperity have only led to further polarization of society. In the political arena, there were now increasing questions that Trump and his movement needed to change their strategy if they were not to finally lose control. But his problems were not limited to the political and economic fronts. On a personal level, his actions have begun to cause growing discontent among those who have traditionally supported his ideas. Politicians, businessmen, even former supporters began to wonder if Trump was no longer the leader he had been during his political career. His actions, such as mass deportations, cutting social programs, and meddling in the internal affairs of other countries, have become unpopular with the general public. This entire political and social context began to create a picture where even his most loyal associates began to question his actions. Another unexpected challenge for Trump was the issues surrounding human rights and his handling of internal conflicts. Accusations of violations of migrants' rights and the legal system became a serious problem for his image. Particularly criticized were cases where migrants, who were deported under Trump's executive order, ended up in countries where they faced threats to their safety. One of the most high-profile cases was the deportation of a group of migrants who were sent to El Salvador, where they were victims of violence. All of these actions by Trump have led to a drastic deterioration of his reputation both at home and abroad. These were the steps that made it appear that his political strategy of getting tough on migrants and social policies may have led to an inevitable crisis of confidence among voters and political elites. The most serious questions, however, arose around his attitudes toward law and justice. When Trump said he planned to run for a third term despite constitutional constraints, it set off a storm of emotion in American society. Speaking about it in a casual manner, he expressed doubts, saying it's interesting. This was not just a joke, but a serious signal that his attitude towards laws and democratic processes could be a threat to the country's stability. Trump's irony about the Constitution showed how deeply he perceives democracy. It was an admission that for him, ambition and the preservation of power are paramount. His statements on the subject were a real challenge to the US legal system and democratic traditions. The political landscape continued to change, and it was already clear that Trump was at the center of not only an economic, but also a political crisis. His previously stable supporters began to leave, and questions about his future actions, especially regarding his possible third term, were being raised with increasing disbelief. Support that had once seemed unwavering began to melt away. It was the beginning of the end for the political era that Trump had built, and the only question remaining was how much longer he would be able to hold on to his position at the helm. What does the future hold for the country and Trump if his party continues to lose key states and important political bastions? All that remains is to watch as this dramatic political movement unfolds and what consequences it will have for America's future.